Hey guys, this is chess coach Andrew Rankin. Welcome back to the series Buffing Your Black Repertoire. Today I just wanted to share a game featuring the Caro Kann exchange variation, but which transposes into the identical line that I've demonstrated with the white pieces in the Queen's Gambit declined exchange variation, and that is the central pawn roller. So you can actually do that same plan here with black, and it can really throw your white players for the loop. And so my opponent, who was rated 2110, I think, and after his loss, he dropped down to around 2100. Clearly had no idea what to do against this, and black just had a really comfortable game. My opponent not only got into time trouble, but made a couple of positional blunders, had really no counterplay, and it was just a really comfortable game for black, and it was clearly just a matter of time before white's position fell apart. So without further ado, the game started with e4, c6, knight to f3, d5, takes, d4. Now we just transposed into your standard Caro Kann exchange variation. I played knight to c6. He played bishop to e3, which is actually a very strong move. And the reason is because after I pin the knight, I'm no longer threatening to take the knight and then win the d-pawn. And the bishop actually really helps support the queenside pawn push here later in the middle game for white. So I like bishop to e3. It's a very solid, very positional move. Now he plays bishop to e2, but I would like to note that the bishop really belongs on the d3 square, and I'll show you the reason here in a little bit. So bishop e2, not the best square. Pawn to e6, pawn to c3, nice and solid. Queen c7, I mean, even though his bishop already developed to the e3 square, after he moved the pawn to c3, I'm not worried about the knight coming to c3 and harassing my queen here. And I do know that I want to make the queen and bishop battery, so why not just prepare it and stop his bishop from going here. He castles, bishop d6, which basically forces the move pawn to h3. Notice if he plays knight b to d2, I can still play... actually, I can't because his bishop breaks the pin. So yeah, maybe knight b to d2 here would be a much better move. Because it keeps him more flexible. If the bishop's going to break the pin on the knight, then why not play knight b to d2, rook e1, knight f1, and then try and get this knight here with support of the rook to e5. So I think this was a little bit of a misplay by him. If the bishop's going to break the pin, then why not keep your pawns back and not make any weaknesses. So h3 is definitely a weakening move, and we just drop the bishop back to h5. And I'm actually really happy for this variation, and I'll show you why. So he plays knight b to d2, which is just the logical development square, and I put the knight on e7, and now he plays the knight back to e1. But let's pretend that he played... let's go all the way back and pretend that he played the bishop to d3. Now maybe e6, castles, queen c7, c3, bishop d6, pawn h3, bishop h5. Let's say knight b to d2, knight e7, and now maybe like rook to c1 or even rook to e1. So in this position, the reason why I was saying that I think the bishop really belongs on d3 is because white sets a little trap here, and black should always be careful when they put the knight on e7 or in the Queen's Gambit declined exchange variation if the g knight develops to the square e2. You can't just lackadaisically castle here because you run into a pseudo Greek gift sacrifice, which is bishop takes h7, king takes, and then knight to g5 check. If you move the king to g6, you're going to get into big trouble, and the best move is to just move the king back, but then you give back the material, and white has a serious mating attack already. So this looks really nasty for black, and that's why you have to be careful. So let's go to the variation that we had. And that's why, yeah, the knight's misplaced, or sorry, the bishop's misplaced on e2. It should really be on d3. But I do like the move pawn to h3, because now the bishop is only one square away from going to the square g6, which is basically the move you need to play before you castle, which stops this sacrifice because the bishop goes here. So I'll show you that variation. Yeah, he offered a bishop trade here, and I just put my bishop on the super strong diagonal. And he continues with the move b4, and I thought this was pretty logical. He's expanding on the queen side where he has a pawn majority. He has 1, 2, 3, 4 against 1, 2, 3. So that's where his pawn majority lies, and this knight can be a little bit susceptible to attack because it runs out of squares pretty easily because it doesn't have the e7 square, and so the move b5 can be quite annoying. But b5 is also a weakening move, and notice the knight can actually go to a5 and then to c4. So if we didn't have the a5 square for the knight, I think b5 would be much stronger. But the fact that the knight's going to go to a5 makes me pretty comfortable. So I just castled. And he plays bishop to h5, looking to trade some pieces and solve his really cramped position, which is really interesting because we're playing the Caro Kann and he's playing with white, which are two indicators that white should have all the space. But in this case, it's really white that feels like his pieces are stepping on each other's toes. I think a better move here would simply to play knight to b3 and then try and get the knight to c5. After you play the pawn to b4, that's really your game plan, so why not continue doing that? So he switches gears here and hopes that I take the bishop and then his queen can come over here. But you notice my knight is guarding the bishop, so I don't really care if he takes. Even if the knight wasn't guarding the bishop, say it went to f5, which I think is a computer move either here or on the next two moves. Even after he takes and the pawn takes, I mean, his only real strong pawn break is the move f4, f5. And if I have a pawn here on g6 and e6, then the f4, f5 plan is never going to happen. So black is just solid as a rock here, but it is time for black to make a plan. You notice this pawn to b4 move really stops the minority attack, so he's basically saying green light on the central pawn roller. So I prepare it by defending the d pawn, because it can end up being super weak after these pawns move, and the queen is eyeing it up, and it could take it with check, which can end up really allowing black's position to fall apart. So rook a to d8, he takes, I take with the knight, he plays the knight to d3, which makes sense. Now he's eyeing both the c5 and the e5 square. So let's continue with our plan and remove one of those squares from him. So I play the move f6. He drops the knight into c5, which is a little bit annoying because it targets the e pawn, but no problem. I'll take a timeout and drop the rook over to e8. Next, I'm just going to play pawn to b6 and kick him out. He puts the knight on b3. I guess he's aiming to go to a5, but I'm going to play pawn to b6, kick this knight out, and now this knight looks really stupid on b3 because I have no idea where it's going. He should have played knight to a6, at least gaining a tempo on my queen, but it's not so clear what the plan is after, let's say, queen to c8 or queen to b7. He could play the move pawn to b5, but then his knight is kind of stuck here. Instead, he drops the knight back to d3, and I continue with pawn to e5. So I was a little bit annoyed by the fact that the d5 pawn was hanging after I play e5, pawn takes, and then the queen would open up. But now that the knight is on e3, he uncoordinates his queen, and so now my d pawn is no longer hanging after the e5 pawn break. And he decides to play a4, and this is definitely the first move of his that demonstrates he really doesn't know what he's doing in this position, and he is really underestimating the positional advantage that black gets after the pawn goes to e4. So this is my new anchor point. This is a nice open file that I get to attack a backwards pawn on, and the plan is simply f5, f4, f3. And I can even swing the queen over, which I do later, to attack this pawn. And if we destabilize the g pawn, and let's say the knight maneuvers. So after, let's say we get the pawn to f4 and we're preparing the move f3, this knight can maneuver over to the f5 square, put pressure on his bishop, put pressure on his king side, and open up the queen for the backwards pawns. And you notice the rooks are just perfectly placed. So black has so much to play for, and it's really not clear how white creates counterplay. Notice all of the attacks on the queen side are just really slow, especially this monster pawn on b6, which prevents him from getting in. So he drops the knight back to e1, and this is an indicator that his position is just not prepared for the attack, because now if you look, his rooks are unconnected, his queen hasn't moved, his knight is on a poor square, this knight is on a poor square, this is basically a tall pawn. So the position is looking very comfortable for black. I continue with knight c to e7. Again, I said that I want to play f5, f4, and then drop the knight onto f5. But I also liked this move because I'm preparing to improve my knight, also defending the center, defending my anchor pawn, and opening up an attack on his c3 pawn. And he immediately underestimates how strong my positional advantage is by just playing the move a5. Now I take the pawn on c3, he takes on b6, and I take back with the pawn, still annoyingly covering all of his entry points for this knight. Now I expected him to play the rook to a6, and I was going to play a move like bishop to c7 and then drop the queen back this way, or even drop the queen back, say here, and try and target the rook as well as this pawn. He drops the bishop back to d2, however, guarding the pawn, and I just go queen to c4, still putting pressure on his center and basically asking him what he's going to do. Also, you notice rook to a6 is no longer moved because the queen guards it. So he puts the rook on c1, and I drop the queen back to b5. Just nice and solid, and I put pressure on this rook. And I want to go back here because when I looked over the game with the computer, I actually should have taken some time here and found a really strong move. So it turns out black has a crushing tactic here. And I'm going to pause my video, and maybe you guys already found it, or if you haven't, take your time and see if you can find it. Alright, so take some extra time if you haven't found it yet. But black actually has a super strong move, which is bishop h2 check. Now, if the king slides over, it doesn't really help his position, so he has to take the bishop. And now the rook is undefended, taking advantage of this really poor coordination on the back rank. And queen takes rook. And this is just absolutely crushing. Notice the king side is going to fall apart. The queen still does a really good job guarding the queen side. The central pawns are super anchored, and f5, f4, f3 is just coming. So I missed that move. I think the evaluation here is going to be -5, -6. Yeah, -6 for black here, so that's just crushing. But I missed that move, and instead I just played queen to b5. Still, we're up a pawn, and it's really not clear what white's plan is. White continued with knight to c2. At least he's connecting his pieces on the back rank. Now I continue with my plan, f5. The knight goes to a3. I mean, these are just one move attacks. White really needed to take a timeout and create a serious plan, because if he doesn't, he's just going to get rolled. So I go queen to a4, putting pressure on these different pieces. He puts the rook back on a1. And now I drop the queen back to d7. And my idea is simply that after I play pawn to f4 and then pawn to f3, I'm destabilizing these pawns, and my queen's going to get in the attack on the king. So notice I pulled 3 pieces, which is 11 points of material away from the center and away from his king. And now I'm preparing to attack his king. He brings the knight back to c2. Still not clear what white's trying to do here. f4. And now he goes queen to g4, which makes sense. Offering the queen trade seems pretty logical here. I didn't see anything better than trading queens. The computer suggests knight to f5, but it's pretty risky pinning your own pieces. That's highly ill-advised. So I just traded, damaged his pawn structure, and I just decided I'll fight for the open file. I still see black's position as being super great. And it's not clear what white's goal is here. Now at least he vacates the b4 square for his knight to jump in. I put the rook on the c file, just pressuring some of his pieces. My threat is simply rook takes rook, rook takes rook, and then rook takes knight. Obviously, if he takes back with the knight, then we're pretty happy. The rook can get into c4 and start to put pressure on his weaknesses. He puts the knight onto b4, and I push the pawn to e3. And the reason I do this is because if he, let's say, takes, then he drops his knight. So his bishop's a little bit overloaded. And notice if this rook is really strong on the open f file, I can always trade it off with rook takes rook. Instead though, he blunders right away and he drops the bishop back immediately. He definitely needed to take first and then drop the bishop back. But I also noticed that after, let's say, pawn takes, bishop to e1, which is the only way the only square he can move to that still guards the knight on b4. Now we can take, and he has to retreat his knight all the way back here, and we infiltrate on the back rank. So this was my idea here, but instead he drops the bishop back immediately, and we could trade rooks first, but I didn't see the reason why, and I simply pushed the pawn to e2. And yep, this rook is trapped, so the game will be over very soon. He brought the knight to a6, not really sure what this is doing here. I don't see any use, but hey, at least he found an outpost. It's way in the corner and not useful, but hey, you found an outpost. I took and made a queen. He took back with the king. I improved my king to f7. He connected his pawns. Now I dropped the knight back to f8, and the idea is I'm going to bring the knight to e6 and start putting pressure here or even here. He brings the rook to the open file. Of course we trade. Bring the rook to the open file. He starts putting pressure on my f-pawn. I improve my knight and put pressure onto his d4 pawn. Notice he can't guard it with the bishop because the rook guards here. So he simply puts pressure on my f-pawn, and I play pawn to g5. And my opponent runs out of time here, but I think he had 30 seconds to think of a move, and he couldn't think of anything. So A, he ran out of time. B, he also probably in his heart had already resigned here. But I hope you guys enjoyed that. The central pawn roller here is really strong. Let's go back to when I pushed the move e3. So you notice you get these really strong pawns. The f pawn, the e pawn, and the d pawn. Usually when they trade off the e pawn for the f pawn, then it's the e and d pawns, and you can always choose which one to push, and it can really cause problems here for white. So here it was the e3 pawn push that just won the game, and yeah, hopefully you guys found that useful, and I hope you guys understand why I play the Caro-Kann and the Queen's Gambit, because the ideas are just so interchangeable, and it's really fun to use them. So, hope you guys enjoyed that, and I'll catch you next time. Thanks. Bye.